Hello, I'm Ben Tuman, and welcome to Skipped History. Today's story is the third of three parts about the portrayal of Black history, or lack thereof, in textbooks. I read about it in an essay by Ibram Kendi in the 1619 Project, History on Trial by Gary Nash, Charlotte Crabtree, and Ross Dunn, and a variety of articles you'll find linked below. In the first two parts of this series, we dissected how a whitewashed version of the past appeared in textbooks from the 1890s to the 1960s. While portrayals of Black history improved in the 70s and 80s, they were still more watered down than a bowl of aquacota, which literally translates to cooked water. In this third and final installment, we'll explore why portrayals of Black history haven't improved much since the 80s, particularly in regards to slavery. This story has a lot to do with Texas, a little to do with religious conservatives, and it begins with a missed opportunity. In the late 80s and early 90s, economic growth slowed in the U.S., and fears ran high that the country was losing its competitive edge. As Ernest Boyer, head of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, stated in 1990, Hondas and Toyotas and Japanese VCRs have us really worried about the national competitiveness. And for those of you too young to remember, a VCR was like an early version of a DVD player, and a DVD was like a CD that played movies. And a CD was this little round disc that replaced cassettes, and cassettes were like mini VHS tapes, and VHS tapes went into VCRs. To address this competitive problem, President George H.W. Bush launched a plan to develop national goals and standards for academic disciplines that will make us internationally competitive and second to none. Experts in math, science, and English developed standards for their respective disciplines, and a history task force, led by Lynn Cheney, chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities, got to work on drafting U.S. history standards. And guess what? They were pretty good. Over 32 months, a diverse group of experienced educators representing just about every religious and ethnic group drafted the national standards for United States history, meant to define what students should know about U.S. history. According to historians, the document's 31 standards encompassed a breathtaking array of historical events and addressed candidly and unashamedly those aspects of our past of which we cannot be proud, like slavery and vicious racism. But there was a slight problem. By the time the standards were ready for publication in 1994, Bill Clinton was president, and some Republicans who'd supported the initiative when Bush was president no longer wanted to be associated with it, particularly the person in charge, Lynn Cheney. As her name suggests, Lynn was married to a future war criminal, and Dick was frequently mentioned as a possible Republican presidential candidate in 1996. So, maybe eager to distance herself and her husband from the now Democrat-led initiative, Cheney published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal called The End of History. The article complained that Harriet Tubman, an African-American, is mentioned 6 times in the standards, while people like Alexander Graham Bell, Thomas Edison, and Albert Einstein make no appearance at all. Of course, 700 white men were identified in the standards, a number several times larger than the number of women and people of color combined, but Cheney forgot to mention this point. She also contested that not a single one of the 31 standards mentions the Constitution, ignoring the fact that there was a whole section on the Constitution, but the word Constitution never appeared in any of the standards' headings, which is like reading the title Pride and Prejudice and complaining that the book doesn't focus enough on gossiping aristocrats or a timeless love story. Predictably, conservatives across the country amplified Cheney's criticism. Rush Limbaugh warned listeners that the standards would indoctrinate students with the idea that our country is inherently evil. Conservative columnist Charles Krauthammer groused that the whole document strains to highlight the flaws of the white males who ran the country for its first 2 centuries. Letters to editors streamed in, saying things like, "From the tone of Mrs. Cheney's editorial, I assume that these guardians of political correctness made little or no mention of the Declaration of Independence." Which is kind of like assuming from my tone that I hadn't been sitting next to the delightful Chia Pet scene in part 1 of this series the entire time. But I have. He's been here all along. Informed or not, the uproar led Bill Clinton to distance himself from the national history standards, and the effort to implement them as guidelines for history teachers and textbooks failed. Which is a real shame, because that meant Southern school boards would maintain an outsized influence over the textbooks that appeared in classrooms. The Christian Coalition, an organization founded in 1987 that offered some of the fiercest opposition to the national history standards, was well aware of this fact. Recall from part 2 of this series that by the turn of the 20th century, most Southern states had embraced statewide textbook adoption to keep textbook publishers from presenting history in a way that reactionary white Southerners didn't like. This practice, and the disproportionate sway it gave Southern states with large student populations over textbook publishers, still existed in the 1990s. Hence why the Christian Coalition's executive director, Ralph Reed, declared in 1996 that I would rather have 1,000 school board members than one president and no school board members, unless that president were composed of 1,000 school board members, and each of those school board members were composed of 1,000 school board members. And so while the Christian Coalition decried the proposed history standards and pushed Congress to adopt bills that protected children against education programs that undermined the values taught at home, they also began funding candidates for state boards of education, especially in Texas. Why there? Well, in 2010, a professor at Texas A&M's College of Education and a longtime player in the state's textbook process revealed that when it comes to textbook content, Texas governs 46 or 47 states. By then, thanks to the efforts of conservative Christians, the Texas Board of Education was staffed by people with very religious views, such as Cynthia Dunbar, a Christian activist who'd written that the U.S. was intended to be emphatically Christian. Other members of the board held old-school, lost cause-y views. For example, Pat Hardy, a former high school teacher, said this at a public hearing.
There would be those who would say, automatically say the reason for the Civil War was over slavery. No. It was over states' rights.
Now, Hardy has a point. There would be those who'd say that slavery was the cause of the Civil War, including the authors of Land of the Free in the 1960s, the coalition that drafted the national history standards in the 1990s, and the authors of the 1619 Project today. In other words, the kinds of people you can trust when they say they've done their own research. But informed by conservatives like Dunbar and Hardy, in 2010, Texas adopted textbook standards that didn't mention the KKK or Jim Crow, instructed students to read a speech by Jefferson Davis that uncharacteristically didn't mention slavery, depicted the cause of the Civil War as sectionalism, states' rights, and slavery in that order, and said that Moses helped inspire founding documents like the Declaration of Independence, which helps explain why the first draft read, King George, let my people go. And let them, and let them, and let them. In other words, after helping to torpedo the national history standards, well-organized Christian conservatives in the 1990s and 2000s ensured that students still wouldn't learn a proper history of white supremacy, the Civil War, or slavery. Not by coincidence. According to a poll of over 1,700 social studies teachers by the Southern Poverty Law Center in 2017, 58% of teachers find their textbooks' depictions of slavery inadequate, and the best textbook achieved a score of 70% against our rubric of what should be included in the study of American slavery. The average score was 46%. And look, I'm not saying that everyone's understanding of history is entirely shaped by textbooks or the CDs with digital instruction that accompany them. And for those of you too young to remember, a CD was like a DVD but I am saying that the portrayal of Black history and slavery in textbooks has been horrible, dating back to when history first began appearing in textbooks. And this shameful history of teaching history is indicative of a more general nationwide refusal to reckon with the legacy of white supremacy. Can we really be surprised that in 2019, a Washington Post poll revealed only 49% of Americans realized that slavery existed in all 13 colonies? Or that, per the SPLC, only 8% of high school seniors can identify slavery as the central cause of the Civil War? I don't think so. Every time that knowledgeable people have tried to accurately portray the country's history, whether it be in the 1880s and 90s, the 1960s, the 1990s, or the 2020s, there's been a vicious racist backlash. And as Ibram Kendi writes in the 1619 Project, until Americans replace mythology with history, until Americans unveil and halt the progression of racism, an arc of the American universe will keep bending toward injustice. In the words of a member of the Texas Board of Education in 2010, amen. Thanks for watching Skipped History. Subscribe to our newsletter for more. See ya.